Hi, everybody. Welcome to Your Move. I'm Andy Stanley. Remember when you were a kid and your parents used to say, "Don't be afraid"? That was really helpful, wasn't it? Is it even possible to decide not to be afraid? Actually, I think it is. And today I'll explain why right here on Your Move. Well, we're in the second part of this series called the N Commandments, and today we explain why it's called the N Commandments. So basically, to catch you up real quick, here's what happened. Jesus shows up on the planet. He launches something brand new. New kind of relationship with God, brand new covenant, brand new movement. He launches the church. And then he died, and when he died, it's like game over. And then he rose from the dead and punctuated everything he taught and punctuated everything he claimed to be. And then he essentially unhitched his movement from the entire Old Testament and then left. And basically, his first century followers were left with sort of a version of a resurrection religion. Not a lot to go on. I mean, they were fired up, they were excited because after it all, if they saw someone die, and then they had lunch with him afterwards. That doesn't happen very often. So they were absolutely convinced, but they were left with this odd assortment of parables and teachings and some commands that, there was like one new command, love one another, and that was kind of set apart as like the big deal. But then there were all these other subsidiary kind of commands, and they all started with an N. And they were all so odd, and they were all so strange, and they were all so impractical. And then you had all these miracles that he had done. All of this is mixed together. And so the first century Christians, that first group of Jesus followers, there was not a lot to go on. Now, for those of you who have read the Bible or grew up with the Bible, understand that the Apostle Paul, who wrote about half the New Testament, he didn't start writing for about 25 years. And even the things that he wrote weren't in circulation until about 30 or 35 years later. So for the first really almost 50 or more years, first 50 years of the church, really all they had was the teachings of Jesus based on these eyewitness accounts from those who had heard him teach, began to write things down, began to circulate these stories. So in this series, what we're going to do is we're kind of stepping back in time and we're asking the question, what would it be like to be a Jesus follower like those first Jesus followers if all we had were what Jesus taught as it related to how we're to live our lives? So we're calling these the N Commandments. And we're calling them the N Commandments because on 5 different occasions, or actually more than 5 occasions, but on 5 different times or 5 different sets of teaching, Jesus gave his early followers 5 things not to do. So the N stands for not. These are things Jesus said, do not do, do not do, do not do, do not do. What if that was all that we had? Because before the resurrection, and here's what's so fascinating, before the resurrection, these 5 nots were completely unrealistic. In fact, none of his followers really took any of them seriously till after the resurrection. And as we go through these 5 nots, you'll understand why. Because they're not even really commands. They're just completely unrealistic. So to give you an example, we're going to jump into the first knot today. So is everybody ready? Yep. Everybody ready? Okay, imagine you don't have a Bible. You're a Gentile, because most of you are Gentiles. You've never read the Old Testament, Adam and who. Okay, you've never heard that story. Noah and the what, you don't know that story. You've heard about Moses, but you don't really care. There were like 600 commandments, but you don't have to do any of those. But you know that Jesus died for your sin and rose from the dead, and you're like, what else? What else? So here's the first not. Here's what Jesus taught us. Here's what Jesus taught his earliest followers. Thou shalt not, you ready? Fear. It's like, what? Yeah, thou shalt not fear. Now, when somebody tells you what you have to do, I don't know, but I kind of get bowed up like, hey, you don't tell me what to do. Like, hey, that's my life. I'll do whatever I want. So don't tell me not to fear. Wait, what? Don't fear? Can you even say that? Like, stop fearing. You afraid? I'm afraid. Well, stop. Okay, I'm sorry. I won't ever do that again. This doesn't even make any sense. This was like Jesus' favorite command. Fear not. Fear not. Fear not. If you don't understand it, we'll rephrase it. Do not be afraid. That's what it meant. Do not be afraid. Over and over, and Matthew especially kind of captures this theme for us. Jesus would tell his early followers, stop being afraid. So one day in Matthew chapter 10, Matthew chronicles for us that Jesus gets his followers together, the 12, and he says, look, okay, we've been together for a while. We're going to split up in teams of 2. I'm going to send you out to do a bunch of stuff. okay? And I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. You've heard that phrase before. That's where it came from. I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Okay, you're the sheep. They're the wolves. And I'm sending you out, and eventually you're going to be arrested. Some of you are going to be beaten up. Some of you are going to have to sacrifice a great deal for following me. But don't be afraid. It's like, what? And then he kind of gave him this specific teaching. Here's what he said. He said, do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid. Okay, wait. Are we supposed to be afraid or are we not supposed to be afraid? Just hold on, guys. Okay, but rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. So you're not supposed to have any fear, but you're supposed to have some fear. And then I think he grinned because they're looking at him like, well, you got to go slower. And he said, okay, let me give you an illustration. Are not 2 sparrows, which were almost worthless in that culture, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. And, he goes on, and even the very hairs on your head are all numbered, so don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. They're like, okay, wait a minute. Okay, so are you saying there's nothing to be afraid of and you're going to keep bad things from happening? But wait a minute, those sparrows, they did fall to the ground. I mean, God watched them fall. Boom. So, and then you just said, like, we're supposed to go out and represent you and we're going to be arrested. And then after you told us we're going to be arrested and probably, suffer for being your followers, then you said, don't be afraid. Okay, so we're not really sure what to do with that. But apparently, they began to connect the dots because they had an experience about 2 chapters before this teaching that kind of put this teaching in a context that we can't completely understand because we did not have this experience. But it's a famous story. It's found in Matthew 8, 2 chapters earlier. So Jesus is, surrounded by the crowd, as you've heard me say before. So in Matthew 8, we're told that Jesus has kind of had it with the crowd. He's worn out. And so he decides to escape the crowd. And a very famous story ensues. Here's what happens. Matthew tells us. It says, then he, Jesus, got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. So first in the boat's Jesus. Jesus says, follow me. They get in the boat. They shove out into the middle, they head off across the Sea of Galilee. Some of you have seen the Sea of Galilee. Sometimes it's referred to as a lake, but it's really like a sea. And suddenly, Matthew tells us, because he was there, suddenly a furious storm, not just a storm, a furious storm, Matthew says, came up on the lake because it's in a valley and the wind kind of gets funneled through the valley. These furious storms kick up. Furious storm came up on the lake so that the waves swept over the boat. Now, I want you to pause for a second. Some of us can't relate to this at all, but many of you have had terrorizing experiences in your life, either on airplanes, small airplanes, large airplanes, lightning storms, boats, tall buildings, tornadoes, hurricanes. Many of you, if you could just think to that time in your life where there was an experience, it didn't last for very long, but you were suddenly scared to death and scared for your life. You were in panic mode. That's where these guys are. Suddenly, a furious storm, and the water is actually coming over the bow of the boat. The boat is filling up with water. Matthew was there. He's telling us about this. But, he writes, remember this? Jesus was sleeping. Now, here's my interpretation. Don't write this down. Matthew wrote Jesus was sleeping because they all looked at Jesus and it looked like he was sleeping, but I don't think he was sleeping. I think he was doing that thing that we've all done who've had kids, when you pretend like you're asleep and you're listening to your kids and all the pandemonium and they're going, shh, Dad's asleep or Mom's asleep. And they're talking and you're really, so I don't think Jesus was asleep because I think he set this whole thing up. But Matthew was convinced he was asleep and maybe he was really asleep. So they're all thinking they're going to drown and Jesus is asleep. Now, here's why this is an important passage. Now, look up here just a second, okay? Some of you have left the faith because there was a tragedy or there was an event in your life and you prayed and Jesus was asleep. And Jesus did not respond the way you thought Jesus should respond. God did not respond the way you thought God should respond. And you just basically said, well, either God doesn't exist or God is asleep or God doesn't care. And you walked away from the faith. So look up here a second and I'm going to move on. I want you to consider coming back to faith, and here's why. Because you're not the first person that happened to. The people that brought us the gospel, the people who knew Jesus best, the people Jesus loved the most, experienced exactly what you have experienced. They thought their lives were falling completely apart, and not only did they imagine that their God was asleep, they saw him asleep. The disciples, the story goes on, you know the story. The disciples went and woke him up saying, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. And he replied, you have little faith, why are you so afraid? To which I'm sure one of them thought, of course, this were condensed, they were expanding, this happened, within seconds. I'm sure one of them thought, permission to speak freely. Did you not read verse 24? Furious storm, waves sweeping over the bow. We may drown. When you may drown, you are afraid. When you may drown, you are afraid. The reason that we are afraid is because we may drown. And when you may drown, you are afraid. What do you mean, why are you afraid? What kind of ridiculous question is that? Then he got up and rebuked the wind and the waves, and it was completely calm. And the men were amazed, and they asked, what kind of man is this? Even the wind and waves obey him. And the only answer to that question is super. He is a super man. Okay, now, this is so fascinating, okay? You should read the Bible. This is so fascinating. In Mark, who probably got his information from Peter, because Mark wasn't a disciple, but Mark wrote one of the Gospels, and we think he traveled with Peter. Peter's version of this, or Mark's written version of this, based on what he heard from Peter and the other guys, was that when this happened, Mark, when he writes it down, it's so interesting. He takes the noun form and the verb form of the Greek word fear, and he puts it together, and he writes at the end of this story, literally talking about the disciples, that after the storm was calm, and after Jesus, calmed the storm, that they, the disciples, feared a great fear. This is so powerful. In other words, they were afraid of drowning, and then they were really afraid after they realized they weren't going to drown. They were afraid of the storm, and then suddenly Jesus does a miracle, and they are more afraid of Jesus because of, oh my goodness, who are we in the boat with? The wind and the waves obey this man's words. And suddenly, perhaps they begin to put two and two together, that maybe our mothers were wrong. There is something to be afraid of. But perhaps it's not what or who our mothers told us not to be afraid of. There is something or someone to be afraid of, but perhaps we've been afraid of the wrong thing all along. And suddenly they perhaps begin to connect the dots. That's right. Don't fear the one that can kill the body but can't hurt the soul. Don't fear the one, don't fear the thing, don't fear the disease, don't fear the storm, don't fear the person, don't fear the empire in their case, that all they can do is destroy the body. Instead, fear or reverence the one that controls ultimate destiny, that controls your soul. Because in that moment, their fear was eclipsed by a greater fear of the one with whom they shared the boat. And then time goes by. Matthew says the lesson wasn't over. A few chapters later, they just performed this amazing miracle with Jesus where they fed 5,000 people, which amazing, it's just amazing. There's all kind of interpretations of that. But they're feeling pretty good about themselves because Jesus, they said, Jesus, we got to feed these people. Jesus said, you feed them. They're like, we can't feed them. He says, oh, yes, you can. Watch this. And Jesus prayed and handed out food, and they started handing out food, and they fed the whole group, and they're like, did you see that? Are we great or what? It's like, we performed a miracle. This is amazing. And then Matthew says, this is so powerful, immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. Now, do you know why Jesus had to make the disciples get into the boat? Because they remembered the last time they got in a boat with Jesus, and it didn't go so well. So Jesus is ready to, he's ready to get, the crowds are everywhere. It's like, we want Jesus. They want to make him king, feed us, heal us, that whole thing. And so Jesus says, hey, let's leave the crowds. We're going to get in the boat. You guys get in the boat. And they're like, okay, we don't get in boats with you anymore. We already did that once. That did not, you need to get in the boat. But this time it's different. It's different. Listen to what happens. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. So he's like, let's all get in the boat, and I'm holding the bow. Holding the bow. Let's push it out, Peter. Let's push it out, Peter. Peter, you jump in. I'll be the last in. Peter's like, no, you get in first. You're Jesus. No, you get in, Peter. Push it out, hip deep water. Jesus pushes it off. Says, see you guys. Now they're in the boat without Jesus. Jesus made them get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. So now you got the same guys probably in the same boat, in the same lake, but now they're without Jesus. Jesus is waving, waist deep water. I'll dismiss the crowd. You guys go to the other side. They know better than to say, how are you going to get over there? He's always, doing stuff, So they begin to obey Jesus. They're going to now do exactly what Jesus told them to do. Jesus told us to cross the lake. You know, we're familiar with this lake. We're fishermen. It's our boat. We will row across the lake, and we'll just, you know, do what Jesus told us to do. This is one of those super famous stories, you know. After he had dismissed them, talking about the crowd, so Jesus goes back by himself now without any, you know, bodyguards, and somehow dismisses the crowd. After he dismissed them, Jesus went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. And later that night, he was there all alone. And the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Now, this time, they're not in a storm. This time, they are rowing into a headwind, okay? They're taking turns, and when you read the whole story and you put all the gospel accounts together, they are out there for hours and hours and hours trying to row across the lake because, by golly, Jesus told us to row across the lake. We're going to row across the lake right into the wind. And the waves are, you know, just right into a headwind, and they're going nowhere. They are rowing in place. It is a rowing machine. This is the first rowing machine. They are stationary, rowing their blisters till they pop. You know, they're rowing. It's pitch black dark. They are worn out, they're tired, and they are soaking wet. Shortly before dawn, they were out there all night long trying to obey Jesus. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. Yeah, you should laugh. Like, here we go again. It's a ghost, they said. And they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, fail. You failed again, okay? I'm trying to teach you something about fear, okay? We've already been here. You should have seen this coming. I mean, last time we were out here, remember that whole fear thing? I fell asleep, calmed the storm. Remember how you feared a great fear? Remember you were afraid of the water, you were afraid of the storm, and then you became more afraid of me than you were the water and the storm. Okay, here we are again. You think it's a ghost, and you cry out in fear. You fail. Guys, look, once again, you were afraid when there was something to be afraid of. Haven't you learned? Guys, once again, are you not paying attention? Once again, you are afraid when there is something to be afraid of. I'm trying to teach you not to be afraid when there's something to be afraid of. Your mama told you, don't be afraid, there's nothing to be afraid of. I'm telling you, don't be afraid, there's something to be afraid of. And you're not learning the lesson. Then he says to them, take courage. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage. It is I. And then here it is again. Don't be afraid. So they're like, wait a minute. So you weren't with us, but apparently you were watching us. Yes. Because one day I will not be with you, but I will be watching you. And just as you did not need to be afraid when I was asleep in the boat or pretending to be asleep in the boat, either way, and just as you really didn't need to be afraid when I wasn't with you in the boat but knew you were in the boat, you don't need to be afraid even when there is something to be afraid of. Here's the lesson. You don't have to be afraid even when there's something to be afraid of. Fear not. Fear not. Fear not. But fear not. You don't have to be afraid even when there's something to be afraid of. This is what Jesus taught his early followers. If you ever decide to follow Jesus, or if you ever re-decide to follow Jesus, or if you ever come back and you deal with fear, because we all deal with fear, as we're going to see in just a minute, this is Jesus' response to our fear. Now, here's something that's really encouraging. They did not learn this lesson then. Right up to the very end. You remember this? Right up at the very end. Jesus is arrested, and what do? Do they stand by their man? No. They are terrified. They all run away. Run away, run away. In the Garden of Gethsemane, they lied, they denied, they hid. They didn't show up for his funeral. They didn't want to be associated with him. If they came for him, they'll come for us. They're scared to death. They did not fear not. They did not fear the one that can control the soul, and don't fear the one that can only harm the body. They went all out for fear the one that can harm the body. They have swords. We have a sword. Jesus told Peter not even to use it. Game over. If they got swords, we don't. We'd run away. I mean, throughout all the teaching of Jesus, the miracles, the walking on water, all the stuff, at the very end, they all ran away because they were so afraid. And then they emerge after the Gospels fearless. It's like somehow they finally got it. And the thing that made all the difference in the world was not another lesson. It was not another boat ride. It was not another lecture. It was not another campfire talk. It was that they saw a resurrected Savior, and once Jesus rose from the dead, they became fearless. Why? Because the ultimate enemy, death, had been defeated. And when they lost their fear of death, they feared not. It's the only explanation. Teaching didn't do it. Miracles didn't do it. Seeing a resurrected Savior changed everything. And here's the fascinating thing. Here's why we're kind of camping out on these knots for the next few weeks. Because the early followers of Jesus got this. The early followers of Jesus got this, that somehow us American Christians and Western Christians, we miss, but there are other Christians in other parts of the world, they get this. That when you come to the conclusion and when you finally stake your eternity on the fact that Jesus Christ really died for your sins and was buried and rose from the dead and was seen and has resurrection life and offers resurrection life, your fear of death begins to evaporate. And once you are no longer afraid of that, once you learn, as Jesus said, to fear not the one that can only harm the body, the disease that can only harm the body, the people that can only harm the body, but you learn to reverence and fear the one that controls your soul, something happens on the inside. And what begins as a completely unapplicable command, fear not, becomes a way of life. In the late 2nd century, there was Marcus Aurelius was the emperor. If you saw Gladiator, the old man who was killed by Commodus, that was Marcus Aurelius, historical figure. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, oversaw what is considered to be the 4th major persecution of Christians. So this is like, 165, 175, 180, this whole persecution of Christians was going on. And during that time, there was what became a famous Roman medical writer or a famous Roman doctor named Claudius Galenus. And Claudius wrote a whole lot of things that have been preserved through antiquity. And in his writings, about a half dozen different times, he actually mentions Christians. Now, something you should know, back in those days, it was illegal to examine a dead body. It was illegal, you couldn't examine a dead body. Once a body was dead, they buried it or they burned it, but doctors they couldn't do, autopsies on dead bodies. So what doctors would do is they would hang around in the arenas and the places where people were dying because they could examine dying bodies, they could not examine dead bodies. So this famous writer, who apparently examined lots of dying bodies, examined the dying bodies of Christians during the persecution of Christians. Now get this. This isn't 20 years after Jesus. This is about 160 to 170 years after Jesus. And Christians are being not just put to death. If you read this section of history, they are being tortured to death. Unspeakable things Christians went through. And in his writings, this doctor, this famous doctor in his generation, wrote the following about Christians. He wrote, "For fearlessness of death and the hereafter is something we witness in them every day." It's amazing. It's like no matter what we put them through, no matter how much we want them to recant, no matter what we put them through, we're trying to extinguish them. We're trying to do like a miniature genocide of Christians. But every single day, their fearlessness of death and the hereafter, they are not afraid to step into whatever's next. It's something we witness in them every single day. It was the fearlessness of early Christians that captured the attention of the Roman Empire because everybody fears death except those who believe in a risen Savior. That's why Jesus could say without batting an eye, look, I know you don't get it now, guys. Fear not, fear not, fear not. Have such great reverence and fear of God that everything else pales in significance. Do you know why Jesus could say to his followers 2,000 years ago? And do you know why he could whisper through the centuries to you, in spite of what you're facing, in spite of what you're dealing with, in spite of the terror that may grip you because of the circumstances you've just found out about? Do you know why he can say to you, fear not? Because he knows how to swim. Because he's been on the water a lot. And because he's been on the very boat you are on in the very circumstances you are in. And he can say to you, you do not have to be afraid, even though there is something to be afraid of, because I am with you, and you need not fear anything or anyone that can only harm your body. Because you have been invited to submit yourself and surrender yourself and to surrender your fears to a God who loves you, who is with you, who's not surprised by anything that's happening to you, and will walk with you through it. And if you think that's pie in the sky and that's hocus pocus and that's just something to comfort us, remember this. Jesus punctuated his command to fear not. Jesus punctuated his command to fear not with just another miracle, but with his own resurrection. I have conquered death. As my follower, you need not fear what I have conquered. Jesus has been there, done that, and came back to prove that he had authority over death. And so those of you who've placed your faith in Christ, those of you who claim to be his followers, Jesus says to you, fear not, even when there's something to be afraid of. And I want you to think about the thing you fear most. For some of you, it's losing a child. For some of you, it's losing another child. For some of you, it's financial. For some of you, it's marriage. For some of you, it's health. For some of you, it's the health of someone you love. What is it that you fear most? What is it that's your boat, that's your storm, that's the waves coming over the bow, that's the, hey, is Jesus asleep? Is God paying attention? Does God care? Is anybody awake up there? What is it you fear most right now? What is your thing? I just want to say to you on behalf of your Savior, fear not. I am with you. Fear not. I am with you. Fear not, even when there's something or someone to be afraid of. As always, thank you so much for staying up late or getting up early. If you go to the website at the bottom of your screen, you can download our free app where you can find all of our Your Move content for free forever. And the app is the easiest way to share these messages with a friend. As always, thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you right back here next week at Your Move.
Also, our website is a great place to watch, download, and share the message you saw today from our series, The 10 Commandments. Be sure to tune in next week to watch Your Move with Andy Stanley.